Okay, so this week we'll have two meetings every day, one at noon finish time and then one at 9 p.m. finish time. So 9 hours ago we had the first meeting and now this is the second. We cover the same topics in both. The reason for two meetings is just the different time zones for people. Just quickly to explain the sort of idea of invisible speed, the goal. The goal is really to gather all the relevant information for racing RC cars in one place, because there's a lot of information out there, but it's scattered all across YouTube and different websites. And it's also not structured in the way where you can start from nothing and then build your knowledge step by step. So you might watch a video that goes really in depth on roll centers, but you don't even really know what that is. And then you might watch a video that's teaching you how to set your ride height. So with invisible speed, you have one place where you have all the information and you can progress at your own pace, learning from the basics and then building on that. And my goal really is to just help to raise the average level of knowledge and understanding among the racers in the world. Because I think that when we understand just a bit more about the cars and about setup and about driving, then going to the track will be a lot more fun. Because when you have a car that's working well, when you are driving more consistently, you're crashing less, your racing will be more fun. You'll do better. And that's, I mean, I think going to the track and racing, that's the whole idea, to do as well as you can. So I think with just a bit more thought going into what you're doing and learning some more basic knowledge, that goes a really long way. And then another benefit is that when there's more people at the track who know how to tune engines, how to build a car correctly, how the basic adjustments affect the cars, then you can also share that knowledge with especially newcomers at your track. So that's really the goals of invisible speed. And my latest YouTube video was about flipping the shocks upside down. The Hall brothers in the UK made a video about that, so I sort of called them out and challenged them to try some different setup ideas instead. And that's another thing that I hope to do. There are some very sort of deeply ingrained myths in car setup and in RC that just have been passed on like dogma from one generation to the other, and they are wrong, but people just believe them automatically. So with giving a good, like building a good foundation of understanding of how the cars work and explaining the why behind many of these things, I hope that some of these myths can be dispelled also. So today, what we'll be doing is we'll make a list of the basic issues that a lot of people have with their cars. So most of the time when people show me their car and ask for some help, I always have to do the same things. So we'll go over those here quickly. And for this, I hope that you also participate. The idea of this course is that it's not just me talking or showing videos. It's also you asking questions and also giving suggestions. So it needs to be more interactive in that way. And that's also the best way for you to learn. So don't be afraid to interrupt at any point if you didn't understand something and we need to explain it in a different way, or interrupt if you have some kind of follow-up question or something else that you just thought of that you would like to know. So this is not a very sort of rigid or set curriculum, so to speak. So just whenever you have something you want to say, just say it.
Okay, then I say it.
Okay, good.
The questions, can that be in any scale or on-road, off-road, or is this purely 8 scale?
Well, the focus is 8 scale off-road, but the questions can be for anything.
Okay.
But if it's for 5th scale, you have to PayPal me €5 per question.
Damn. Then I hang up here.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
No, any scale, on-road, off-road, electric, nitro, anything goes. Yeah, so we'll make the basic list of issues. Then we will also make another list of terms. So before we start talking about driving and setup, I think it's good to just make sure that we are all talking about the same thing. Like if I say rotation, what does that mean? Or any other term that has to do with setup. Responsive, what does that mean? So we come up with terms and then we define them so that we are speaking the same language. So that when I explain something, we all understand it in the same way. So that's what we're going to be doing today. And since we already had one meeting, we have something to work off of. So I'm going to share my screen. This is only for adults, so we don't censor words. I tend to say that I have to unfuck people's cars because they're built wrong. So the first thing is freedom, okay? Free like America. If it's supposed to move, make sure it does. When I get a car to check, someone brings me a car and asks me to give some advice. The first thing I do, I feel the suspension. I sort of make sure just to check that everything is built as it's supposed to. And a very simple piece of advice is that if something is supposed to move, make sure it's moving freely. Take the shocks off your car, work the suspension up and down, make sure that there's nothing that's binding. If you can feel that something is binding, you'll probably have to start disassembling parts to find a bent hinge pin or maybe a hinge pin where the outer hinge pin where the nut is tightened too far and it's rubbing on the arm or some other problem. So you need to identify which moving part is binding. So after you've checked all of this, you know that everything that's supposed to move is moving freely. This can include the steering, the bell cranks themselves, the Ackerman plate, all the links, suspension, hinge pins. When you put the shocks on, one thing that I've noticed on various cars is that sometimes the shock caps can bind, or even the ball end of the shock in the arm if you over tighten them. So the shock needs to be free when it's on the car. You need to be able to twist the cap a bit or the ball end, because as the suspension moves, the shock also rotates around those points. Also, the drivetrain needs to turn smoothly. If you have bad bearings, that's going to cause handling issues. So check your bearings, check your drivetrain, that nothing is worn too much, like a CVD drive shaft or an out drive, where at some point, as you're rotating the drivetrain, it catches. Those are all going to cause you problems on track. Anti-roll bars is another point where people sometimes tighten them too much, where they attach to the gearbox and they can't move freely. So when you mount your anti-roll bars, always mount them without the ends attached, and make sure that when you lift them, you can lift them all the way up, you let go, they drop down. So the anti-roll bar should be able to move completely freely. Then linkage, so throttle linkage and brake linkage. There can't be any kind of binding there. So as you move the servo, add throttle, back to neutral or brake, all the linkage needs to be able to still move freely. So even at neutral, you just hold the servo arm at neutral, you pull the throttle, it needs to be able to open and then close on with the tension of the spring or return spring or whatever you use. So it's important that nothing in the linkage is binding at any position. Do any of you have other comments for issues on cars that have to do with this?
So when you say about anti-roll bars, you mean
Yeah.
So when you install an anti-roll bar, then you put it onto the bulkhead, screw it up so that it moves freely, and then you put it into the end socket things.
Yeah,
What
because
called those?
if you just attach the roll bar to the gearbox and the ends to the arm, you can't tell if the anti-roll bar is binding a bit or not, because normally cars have some set screws there that you tighten to eliminate the play. So to be sure that it's not binding in any position, you don't attach the ends. You just have the anti-roll bar on the gearbox, and then you set the play so there's a bit of play, and the roll bar can move freely. And then after that, you attach the ends to the arms.
Oh, thanks.
And this also goes for cars like the Mayako that uses bearings, because on either side you have collets that lock the roll bar in place. But if they are too tight, then that can also cause binding. So even though the roll bar is on bearings, you still have to make sure that there's a slight side-to-side play. So the same thing applies even if the roll bar is on bearings. Okay, so then another thing.
I'd like to add something real quick on that.
Okay.
Just with the, checking people's cars. When I would use my driving schools that I had, I think the throttle and brake linkage is a really big thing to check. Like you're saying, it being free, but then also like one thing I would always check would be their deadband for their throttle. So, the call it on their servo horn to when the throttle, how much you move your trigger on your radio basically before the throttle starts to open. And then the same thing on the brakes, how far your trigger moves forward and, on the braking motion before your brakes actually kick in. And some people have those, either too tight, which normally isn't the case. Normally, I always found it's too loose. So then your throttle and your braking inputs are just delayed.
Yeah, that's noted here. So that's actually a setup feature also, especially on the brake, because some drivers like their brakes to engage very quickly, where there's just a slight movement of the brake on the trigger and the brakes start engaging, and others like to have a bit more play there. And that's just determined by where you place the collar on the brake link. So yes, those details are very important. Other radio settings that I check are the endpoints. So especially on 8-scale buggies, you need to set the endpoints with the car on the table. So if the car is up on a stand and you set your endpoints, when you put the car down on the table, then you'll notice that you don't have full lock. So the best way really is to put the car on the table and then set the steering so you get full lock. Then
why is that then?
That's
why would you not get the same out of it?
Because of the resistance of the tires on the surface, and also any play or flex in the steering system itself. So when it's in the air, there's no resistance, so you
Sure, yeah,
you can get full lock.
But then when you put it on the table, how do you measure that you've got the right amount, or is it just visual, just by the eye?
So I think all cars have sort of a stop. The inner tire will stop at some point. The knuckle hits the C hub or on a pillow ball. I guess the pillow balls will sort of limit the steering at some point. So you set it to that for maximum steering.
Okay, so you set it to the maximum that
Yeah.
it can go without being stopped.
Yeah, someone also asked that, what about reducing the dual rate? So reducing the amount of steering left to right. Do I ever do that? I don't do it in off-road ever, but I have done it in touring car. But I mean, it works the same for off-road too. If you have a situation where the setup of your car is sort of a good, safe setup, it's stable, but you just feel like you have too much steering, reducing the dual rate could be a way to get less steering. You can still drive the same way you're driving. It's just that the wheels are turning less, so your car will steer less. So reducing dual rate is a way to reduce steering, but I don't think that any sort of top drivers actually do that. Would you agree, Jared?
Yes. Some people do kind of use that as a setup tool. One person that messes with their radio a lot that I know of is like Rivkin. As far as like Expo and dual rate and things like that. I'm kind of like what you're saying. I will use dual rate as like a band-aid where it's not like a fix per se, but if I'm in my warm-up laps, I'm like, oh shoot, my car has way too much steering. This is going to be too difficult for me to drive. I'll turn my dual rate down a little bit. And I normally go pretty small increments. Like, I might only go 3%, do a couple corners, see if that's better. I'm not going to go down like 15% or something like that. Like, I'm going to be in that 5 to 7% range probably. But it's more of it caught me off guard and now my car is steering too much. I don't necessarily use it as like a planned setup tool.
Okay.
Do you not find that the servo maxes out though before it hits the maximum movement?
What
buzzing.
what radio do you use?
I use a Soundware MT44.
Oh, okay. Like it starts buzzing, or you can't actually add more EPA.
You can, but it's on the servo rather than the. So did you say servo? Sorry, the servo is a.
No, I'm just talking about like if you're setting your endpoints. Like I know with the KO, there's a thing called travel, and I have to max that out. Like it's set at 100, but if I use that at 100 and I try to set my steering inputs, it's going to go to 100 on the EPA and it's going to be maxed out. But that travel setting will go all the way to 150. So I maxed that out at 150 before I start setting my EPAs. So I wasn't sure if that's what you were saying, to where you physically can't add EPA, or you're just saying when you're trying to set your steering, then the servo is buzzing.
Yeah, it's a servo, so you can set the radio will go further, but typically and I'm most of my experience is sort of on-road 12 scale, but the way that I'd set it up is move the servo sort of as far as it will go, say to the right before it starts buzzing, and I'll take that as my endpoint rather than maxing it out.
If it's buzzing, you're probably going past the throw of the actual wheels, and then the servo is buzzing because it's trying to go further, but it can't move any further. So yeah, you might be past the endpoint area, but I'm not familiar with the 12 scale. Like I don't know if it has steering locks side to side, like what Joseph was talking about. But yeah, I would say if you're hearing a buzzing, then you're going too far.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Yeah. One thing that I do when I check my steering endpoints is I feel the tension on the inner wheel. So if I'm checking my left steering, like Joseph said, you want to do it on the ground. You don't want to do it up on the car stand or anything. You want to do it like at ride height level on the ground.
Mhm.
So if I'm checking my left throw, I'm going to feel my left tire. And when I'm fully locked to the left, you're going to feel that tension, and your inside tire will be kind of wobbly feeling until you get enough throw to where there's full tension on it. And you can feel that like resistance when you go to kind of, you know, turn it back some, if that makes sense. So I kind of set mine based on that tension. Like I want there to be tension on the inner wheel at full lock.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, because that's actually what's happening on the track too. So when you're driving around the track, there will be this sort of self-centering force. The tires actually are trying to straighten out, and the servo is keeping them turned. So that's kind of what you can do. What Jared said, that turn all the way, and then you feel the inside tire try to straighten it out a bit. So if there is no tension there on the track, your tires won't physically turn all the way. There will be a gap. So you need that tension to get full lock when you're in a corner.
So that's tension on the tire, or that's tension on the wheel that you're holding?
On the car, the tire, so try to straighten that out. You turn all the way, and then try and straighten it out. Yeah, so then throttle and brake endpoints on nitro. I think most drivers, they tend to set their throttle endpoint so that the carburetor opens to the size of the venturi. So it could physically open more, but it's limited on the radio. So you don't open it more than that. And then for the brake, that endpoint, it needs to be set in a way where you can still add more brake if needed. So that's something that's relevant for us with Mayako now, is that we need to add more brake during a race. And on most radios, that's easy to do. But if you've built your linkage to where you're already at the limit and you can't add more brake, that's a problem. So these kind of issues are very important to check on your radio and linkage. Then if we move on, after these basic checks, so everything that's supposed to move is moving, everything is free, the radio settings are okay, endpoints are okay, linkage is good. Then what I check is the suspension. So I find that it's common for people to have shock oil that's way too heavy for some reason. That seems to be the trend. The best way to know what shock oil to run is to learn to understand the feel of suspension. So if you're at the track and there's someone whose car is really good, the local fast guy, he's winning all the races, he seems to know what he's doing, his cars look good on the track. Feel his car on the table. What does the suspension feel like? And when I say that, don't just press down on it, but also work the front suspension quickly up and down and see what happens. Same for the rear. So you get a good feel of the damping, how heavy it feels. If a car has very heavy damping and you try moving it up and down quickly, the suspension won't have time to react, so the wheels will start moving up and down and hitting the table. If the oil is very soft, the suspension will feel very springy. You can feel the spring, you don't feel much resistance. So this is something that's difficult to describe or explain. You have to learn for yourself to feel it. And it's also important because it's maybe one of the most common questions I get is, what oil should I use? Well, temperature affects oil drastically. if you just look on a setup sheet and it doesn't mention the temperature, then it doesn't really help you, because if the setup sheet was made in 35 °C weather, I don't know what that is in your freaky American Fahrenheit, hot weather. If the setup sheet was made for hot weather and you are in cold weather, let's say 10 degrees, then that shock oil that you put in won't work at all. It will be way too thick. So for cooler temperatures, you need thinner oil. For warmer temperatures, you need thicker oil. So because of this, setup sheets are often not very much help. I really recommend that you learn to feel the damping that you need for yourself. And then you start keeping notes for yourself and noting down the temperatures. So with this piston in this temperature, this is the oil I use. So whatever the situation, you'll always know where to start. If it's 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, you'll know what oil to use.
Hey, Joseph, I have a question there on the temperature.
Yeah.
Have you seen any manufacturer setup sheets that actually allows you to enter the temperature?
Yeah, Mayako does.
You don't need to really. On my setup sheets, I tend to put a cold weather and a warm weather oil on mine, and there's quite a few drivers that will do that on their setup sheets.
Yeah, I think we have a temperature on Mayako setup sheet.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
weird that it should be kind of so people learn to put it there.
Yeah, it's important, I would say.
Yeah, but it's a personal preference thing too, so it's difficult. I mean, at some point, the customers and just like the average racers, you have to take a little responsibility on yourself to, start to understand the car a little bit and not just fully rely on setup sheets that you see. Sometimes they're not, like Joseph was saying, you got to learn what the feel is. And then certain people like different changes for temperature. Like for me, I will only change 50 CST for a temperature. So I only have a 50 CST change. Like if it's 30 degrees Fahrenheit, which, would be like 0 Celsius, or if it's 100 Fahrenheit, I'm only going to be a 50 weight difference. So my car at 30 degrees on the bench, like Joseph's saying, is going to feel pretty thick, and it's probably not going to feel that good on the bench. And then at 100 degrees on the other end of the spectrum, my car is going to feel pretty light on the bench. But if I try to get it to always feel the same on the bench, then I don't like the feel on the track. There's other people that will change more in that temperature range, but that kind of depends on the person. For me, I only change 50 CST no matter, just for cold weather versus hot weather.
That's interesting. Can you explain a little bit more why you wouldn't kind of compensate more for the temperature? Wouldn't you want to have the kind of the same feeling regardless of the weather?
Yeah, just for me, like the cold weather, if it's really cold, what I do is I heat my shocks up a little bit with a heat gun before I set my ride height. And I feel like that, because if you set your ride height with the shocks really cold, your ride height's going to be a different height. And if it's really cold and I make my car feel good on the bench, out on the track, I feel like my car is too soft. And when I go too soft on the oil, I lose traction and you lose the pack. And I'm really particular with the pack feel that my car has. So if I don't have enough pack, I normally don't have enough traction. So, I can't go too light when it's cold. And then it's almost the same thing when it goes hot. when it gets to a certain temperature degree, like I would say my realm is kind of like 90. Once it's like over 90, my cars normally feel really soft on the bench. And sometimes I think like, man, I should probably thicken it up some. But every time I try to go a little thicker, I just don't like the feel of my car. I'll use like the LCRC Nats, for example, at the warm-up race when we went there. This was 2 years ago, Nats, I think. It was really hot, and my car in the semi was pretty good, but it just, my shocks felt like they had water in them on the box, you know, or on the bench, I mean. And so like, I have to go up 50. And then I went 50 higher than my hot weather range for my oil, and my car was terrible on the main. It didn't jump good, it didn't land good. I lost a little bit of traction, and it felt way better on the bench. But with the shocks working on the track, it was just too heavy for me. And so just over time, you know, with all my racing, I've just learned that I can't change my shocks range that drastic. You do need to have a little bit of a range that you go through, and different pistons are going to act different too. So, you know, but when I have like a piston setup and a shock package that I like, for me personally, I only have a 50 split for hot weather, cold weather. And it's difficult to kind of find where that like middle ground is. For me, it's probably like that 60 degree, I would say like 60 to 70 degree Fahrenheit range is where I switch from my cold weather to my hot weather shock setup. So that's a little difficult to figure out, like when you want to change that. You know, especially races like DNC or something like that, where some years it's, you know, it might take a 30-degree temperature change during the day. And so like I'll have one set of shocks that I run during the daytime, and then I have a separate set of shocks that I run at the nighttime that have 50 lighter oil.
Help us understand the difference between harder springs and harder oils, because it's sometimes hard to differentiate.
So the oil is what is keeping the car up. So when you press down, you let go. The spring is what pushes the car back up to ride height. The oil is what slows that movement down. So when you feel, basically, if you want to understand this, just assemble your shocks with no oil and feel the suspension. Okay, that is what you are feeling when you move the suspension that's caused by the spring. Most of what you feel is the resistance of the oil when you move the suspension. So it's a setup option. So if you run a suspension that's very soft, you would also run softer springs, because there's a relationship between the spring and the oil that you want to keep. If you run a very hard suspension, so very thick oils, a lot of damping, then you run harder springs to, again, maintain that relationship between the spring and the oil. But these are the things that are very hard to describe and very hard to understand just looking at the setup sheet. You have to know the feel yourself. Does David have anything to add to this? Ronefalk, how he knows that he's in the right sort of shock oil range?
Well, like you said, I think I think it was Bas that I asked before, whether it was like easier to get away with the car being too soft than being too hard when you know trying to find the sweet spot, let's say. And I would say like you said, it depends on the track. Of course, it does, but I would say it's probably easier. You know, just going over all the conditions. I think it would be easier having a car being too soft than too hard, because obviously, if you would be in a bumpy condition, the car would be very difficult to drive. So I think it making a car a little softer it's probably better than making it too hard. And then if the car is squatting a lot, moving around a lot in the suspension, then you have to go thicker, obviously. But I think it's better to then start off a little softer than stiffer, basically. So then it's always a difficult with the temperatures, like you've just talked about. You know, I can look at a setup sheet running 5-hole 1.5s in the front, 5-holes 1.6 in the rear. From let's say from a race where I have 35 degrees in south of Europe in the summer, and if I will run the same piston, like for example, we ran those piston at the DNC in like 10 degrees Celsius then, and I think I was at 42.5, 35 probably. So that's like, what is it, like 30 VT soft in the front, because then in the summer I would be at like 70 probably in the front with those pistons, 70, 50 or something like this. So temperature does make a huge difference. And yeah, it's just something you have to kind of take note of yourself as well. I have like a note section in my phone that I try to just write down the different temperatures, like when I use what choke oils, like for example for 10 degrees, 15 degrees, 20 degrees. So I have like, you know, the 5-hole piston, 515, 516. I know where I need to start at when I go to a track, because I can see the forecast shows 20 degrees. So okay, I can check in 20 degrees I use this oil, and then in 30 degrees you have to go thicker, obviously. So it takes some time. And also I would say one thing is, like, if you're running a piston with less pack, the shocks need to feel stiffer on the car than running a shock piston with more pack, obviously. So for example, like a 6-hole 1.3 versus a 5-hole 1.5, the 5-hole you need to run way heavier oils, not just because you have less pack, but also because with the piston having less pack, the oils need to be thicker. So running more pack, you have to go thinner. The feel on the car has to be thinner. So that's basically what I would want to add to what you just talked about.
Yeah, I think that's a good way actually to simplify, to say that when you are looking for the right range or the right shock oil to run, start from the thin side and then keep going thicker. I think that makes sense, yes.
Can I add something up to what David said?
Yeah.
Because is it okay to say that if you go harder oils and harder springs, the car is like harder and easy contact, but when you add the harder springs, it's somehow like adding rebound, because adding harder oils doesn't give you rebound, obviously. It slows the car down, but adding harder springs gives you like more rebound, right? So it works differently. And is there easy way to spot for a rookie when your car have too much rebound, so it's not to go heavier on the springs, or maybe go lower, and instead of going on heavier springs to go on heavier oils? I don't know if it doesn't make any sense, but yeah.
It was for David? Oh.
Yeah, or for you, if the question is easy. I don't know.
Well, David can answer
Because
first.
sometimes it has to decide, and yeah.
Well, I would say first of all, like when it comes to the springs, I feel like in 8 scale, I don't tune the car a lot with the springs. In 10 scale, I would probably do it more so. But on the 8 scale, I kind of use like for the Mayako, then if we talk about the Mayako, I use like a black front spring and the brown rear. And yeah, I would probably be on that kind of spring setup in 90% of the conditions, let's say. So it would be, if we were really looking to fine tune the setup, that's when I would start, trying maybe softer front or even a stiffer rear spring. So I work more with the pistons and with the thickness of the oil and how heavy I like the car to feel with the shock package, just keeping the same springs. So that's for 8 scale, like I said. If it was 10 scale, I think that the springs are even a bit more important. I definitely noticed that at the Worlds in Slovakia in 2019, where I was on the wrong springs. I just put a different set of springs that I should have used from the start, and I kind of gained like 3/4 just getting more grip out of the two-wheel drive. So, yeah, maybe there's so much stuff that you can, I mean, for us to think about as well. So, I think I just like to narrow my things of what I changed on the setup, and spring is not really a top priority. So yeah, I mean, I can't really say if there's a relation to that, like you just asked. Maybe Joseph has something to add.
Maybe just that if your spring is sort of, if your spring and oil relationship is so that the spring is hard and the oil is too soft for that spring, well, one is you feel that on the table. So that's why I say it's so important that you learn to understand the feel of the car by just feeling it on the table. But then on the track, what happens is the car is very reactive and responsive, and it feels like it's sort of bouncy and springy and on the track. And that's something you also will learn to feel when you drive. So if the car looks and feels very high on the track, and maybe it's easily traction rolls in corners or rolls off bumps, it doesn't feel sort of sucked into the track. You don't feel safe driving the car around the track. Then that could hint towards spring that's too hard to the oil, or oil that's too soft for the spring.
Thank you.
Do you think for someone that's trying to find the shock oil range, would you say it's easier to approach it from thin oils and then keep going thicker, or from thick oils and start going thinner?
For me, I would say it's probably easier to feel it going from thinner to thicker.
Okay, that's the same thing that Ronnefalk said earlier. So when you start adjusting your oils, start from a thin feel and start going heavier until it starts getting worse.
Yeah, I would say that's an easier judgment, I would say.
Yeah. So then, as I said, it's good for you to keep notes. These days with our phones, it's easy to just write quick notes when you're at the track. That's what I do. So I have lists of the different pistons and what oil I use, in what conditions, what temperatures. And then when you have that for yourself, it's so much easier to know what to run. And then just a sort of a rule of thumb here is that when you have less and bigger holes, like a 5-hole piston, 5 1.5, 5 1.6, for example, it will feel heavier, thicker on the table when you feel it, versus more small holes. So let's say a 7 or 8-hole piston with 1.2, 1.3, for example, then that setup will feel thinner on the table. It's just something to keep in mind also. Okay, then After the shocks, after setting the
Sorry,
yeah,
question still about shocks.
okay.
So Jared mentioned about I just want to come back a little bit to the heating things. So when you build the shocks, do you warm them up a little bit before you close the cap?
That depends on where you're kind of racing. I try to bleed my shocks in like the same temperature that I'm gonna be racing in. So, if it's the summertime and say, you're working on your car like at your house or something and it's cool inside, and then you're gonna go race and it's gonna be hot outside, your shocks are gonna build pressure when the heat goes up. So then your shocks are gonna be pressurized and they're not gonna work right. So, if you do that, you want to just set your shocks outside in the sun and get them up to temperature, and then bleed them when they're warm. Same thing, like if I'm racing in the cold, then I want to bleed my shocks in a similar temperature. If I'm going to be racing somewhere, like if I'm going to club race or something and it's going to start out warm and then it's going to cool down, I would much rather bleed my shocks in the part of the day and then run the same bleed when it gets cold than the opposite, because you don't build pressure when temperature goes down, but you do build pressure when temperature goes up. So that's for like building them. What I was saying about heating them a little bit to set the ride height is just so that my ride height is accurate. If the shock is really, really cold and it feels really thick on the table and you set your ride height, the car, once it starts heating up on the track and your shocks are moving a bunch, your car is going to be set a little bit too high. So that's why I just warm them up just a little bit, like I'll feel my car. I'll put a heat gun, I'm not putting it directly on the shock or anything like that. I'm just kind of warming them up some. And then I'm feeling my car on the bench until I kind of, you can feel it soften up a little bit. Like Joseph said, it's going to take some time. It's kind of like tuning an engine. Once you just start learning what the throttle feels like and sounds like, then it starts making sense. So the shocks are going to make sense more once you just start feeling them more often. So that's just a habit. Like if you see most pros, like I have a certain way I feel my car on the bench, how I drop my car, and just some little things like that. So that's why when it's really, really cold, I'm talking more like extreme cold conditions, then I warm my shocks up a little bit before I set my ride.
Thanks.
Okay, so then the next thing, shockles are set, measure everything. Check everything carefully. Attention to detail, that's key. Calipers are a must-have tool. You measure turnbuckles, shock lengths for droop. All of these measurements, settings on the car, you need to check and make sure that they are correct. Because often people will say, oh, I'm running this setup, but actually they're not, because so many things are off. And on our cars, it doesn't have to be by much. 1 millimeter here, 0.5 millimeter there, that a different pill setting to what you thought, and your car will handle completely differently. So these things are important, and it pays to take some time and pay attention to all the details. This, I cannot really overstate this, because I have had situations where people ask me for help because they're having some issue with their car, and the only thing I really do is just make sure that the setup is correct. Adjust everything left to right, set droop correctly, all of these things, very, very basic things. And then they go back out on the track and they wonder what I changed. And I didn't really change anything. I just made sure everything was set correctly. Maybe I changed the ride height, changed the droop to what they said they were running, you know, stuff like that. But I didn't really make an effort to change the setup from what they said they are running. So this is really important.
I have a question on that. And when we've discussed or asked questions about setup stations for the 1/8 scale, the toe in, was it toe in? No, the camber. The camber, yeah, it was the camber. So
Yeah.
negative camber. You were saying that there's a different, when it's on the setup station, it would read a certain value, but when it's on the table, when it was on the table, it would be a lesser value. But you want the value that's kind of, or the value that's quoted in the setup sheets is typically when it's sort of sat on a table rather than on a setup station. How's that kind of worked out, or is it just from experience?
I think that it would be quite valuable to have a note on the setup sheets to know if the values are with a setup station or without, because for camber, for example, it will be about 1.5 degrees more if you use a setup station. So on a setup station, if you have a value of 3 degrees camber, with tires it's going to be more like 1.5. And that's just because the tires stick to the table, so they don't allow the any play to become relevant. So on the setup station, it's on ball bearings, so it's going to slide to maximum camber, where the tires stop that from happening. So there's always going to be that difference.
I guess it depends on the tires to some extent as well. There'll be a bigger difference with some tires than others.
Could be, but I think in general, just with tires, it's one value and setup station another.
Okay.
Well, that
I
depends. That
Can I just
depends
add
very
something
much
to
if
the,
you roll your car too. I mean, I feel like camber is very difficult to set. And I have a different opinion on some of this stuff, but yeah, I think putting numbers on the setup sheet I think is difficult because if you just drop your car versus if you drop your car and roll it forward, you're going to have a much different camber reading.
Yeah, that's why we have the turnbuckle length on the Mayako setup sheet, because that's usually the best way to compare. If you want to compare between different cars, like if you want to check Thibaut's setup, the best way is to read that measurement on the link and then do that. That's also not always accurate, because very often there are different arms, different parts that are being tested, and if there's a slight variation there, then that's going to be reflected in the link length also. So, but
Yeah,
still, I would
sometimes
say that's the best way to compare.
Sometimes there's differences left to right. It's minute, but sometimes there is differences left to right. And I've found over the years of doing it that the scrub on the tires definitely changes camber. Like if you roll your car backwards and have a look at the difference compared to rolling it forwards, and we're traveling forwards, so you get a more accurate reading with that drop and slight roll forwards. It's loading the scrub on the tires.
Yeah, I agree. That's how I set mine. I don't want to impede on what Joseph is trying to teach here. We have different opinions on this area, but yeah, I've had that same experience, and same with measuring. I don't really measure my left to right either, to try to make them equal, because whenever I make them equal, I feel like one side's always off. But it is a good idea, like Joseph's saying, if you're just checking someone's random car, if you're checking side to side and it's a 5 millimeter difference, then yeah, you have a big problem. But it is common to have one side be maybe, 0.5 millimeter difference. And, you feel like your camber is set correctly or your toe is set correctly or something like that.
we're going to talk about camber on Thursday, so then we can go through how to set it and how we think it's best. So looking forward to that on Thursday. Okay, so then moving on, last point, pro driver setups. This, I think, is a good rule of thumb. Unless you're racing the top pros, don't look at their setups. That should be ingrained in everyone's brain, because very often drivers want the setup that just won the big race. What did Mayfield run? What did Thibaut run? What did Ongara run? Those setups are more than likely not going to help you, because your skill level is so different. The speeds you are going around the track, your lap times are so different that the requirements you have are different. So because of that, it really pays to work on a setup for you, for your skill level and for your speed. And normally the best place to start for that is the kit setup. So whatever the manufacturer recommends you start with should be a setting that's very neutral, stable, works in all kinds of different conditions and for all kinds of different driving styles. And probably a setting that isn't so specific that if you're a bit off here and there, you haven't paid attention to detail like we spoke about, it's still going to be okay. Whereas many of the top pro setups are very particular. You have to be very precise when you adjust it on certain settings. And also when you drive it, you have to be more precise. So often the top drivers' cars have a lot of steering. They're responsive. So initial steering is high, but also a lot of rotation in corners. So you might feel that the car is loose. The front end turns a lot. The rear end might feel loose to you. Another thing that's common is that when you get on power, the car is hard to control. Maybe you get on power and the rear end feels loose, or maybe you get on power and it wants to collapse onto the rear end, because you can't just go full punch. You have to increase the throttle gradually. You have to know how much throttle to give, and you have to apply the throttle to the correct amount for the car to work. So because of these things, I don't think it's a good idea to look at the top driver setups. It's much better to start with a basic kit setup and then learn to understand which changes you need to make for yourself. Now, earlier today, in the meeting, we had some good questions and comments about this, that are there some exceptions to this rule? And I think that shock pistons is an exception. So let's say that Jared is racing at DNC and he changes to a 5-hole piston, 515, 516, for example. Well, he's doing that for a reason. So probably on that bumpy track, the 5-hole piston is better than, say, a 7-hole. Well, let's say that Jared then went to the IBC track in Portugal. Maybe Jared would go to a 7-hole piston with angled holes, because a piston like that is a lot better on high grip, smooth tracks. So in these situations, I think that you can actually copy what the top drivers do, because they are doing something that will work for you also. So pistons for various tracks, yes, you can look at top drivers. For diffs, I think you can see the direction to go. So if the top pros are going to thicker diffs, I think it's a good idea also for you to go to thicker diffs. On a high grip track, that's what normally happens. Smooth high grip, drivers go to thicker diffs. You should do the same. On very loose tracks, top drivers often, especially on bumpy loose tracks, they would go to thinner oils. Well, I think you can see that that's the direction you should go but probably you should go to even thinner diffs than what they do. So if a normal setup is 10-10-5 and pros go to 7-7-4, maybe you go to 5-5-3, you know, same direction, but even further, because thinner oils will be more easy to drive. And then for tires, I think for tires, you shouldn't just look at what the pros are running and then run the same, but it makes sense to talk to them, because they will probably know that, okay, this tire is very good, but it's a bit too easy to drive, not fast enough. I'll pick this other tire, which is the fastest option, but it's a bit harder to drive, and I'll deal with it and I'll be faster. So then if you just look at what they're driving, you would be picking the wrong tire for you. But if you speak to them, they would be able to tell you this. They say, okay, I'm running this, but you should run this other tire. It's going to be easier to drive. And for you, it's probably going to be faster. So, does anyone have anything to add to that?
I'll add a couple things. I would say that you are pretty accurate with all of that. I would add to that certain pro drivers will be able to run closer to, but then just kind of knowing, like I would say the general rule of thumb, like you were saying, you know, most pro drivers cars are going to have more steering. I would say too, the pro drivers cars are going to have less grip. That's a common thing of when I go to like more local races, people come up to me and go, man, how does your car have so much grip? And then I let them drive it and they literally spin out coming out of the first corner that they go into. And, you know, it's like, well, my car doesn't actually have as much grip as it might look. I think that's probably the biggest thing that people run into. And yeah, I would say you were pretty spot on with a lot of that stuff. The shock pistons are going to be something that's pretty track dependent. Diff settings are going to be something that's pretty track dependent. And, you know, tires, that's a good point too. Like, you know, just to use me and Graham for an example. Graham, if you guys don't know, is my pit guy that goes to all the races with me. Ski races also, but he's in like the intermediate level. And a lot of times we don't run the same tire because he can't drive the tire that I'm running. And if I run the tire that he runs, I'm too slow. So just like Joseph was saying, you know, the tire stuff, if you're at a big race and there's, you know, a pro driver there, or even if you run into a pro driver or someone that, you know, you're better guy at your local race, you know, it doesn't hurt to just talk to them for a little bit. And, you know, most of them will be, you know, take the time to talk to you and hopefully give you some good advice. But yeah, the tires, there's definitely different tires that work better for the pros that won't work for your average driver, especially like if you're in the US and you go to like the race time events or, you know, like the indoor arena races, to where we get like a narrow groove and, you know, we're able to drive in the narrow groove and the pro classes clean that groove up more. So we can run a totally different tire, sometimes even a completely different compound. And then like the sportsman or the intermediate races, people are kind of driving all over the track, not in the same spot every time. So then the track is dirtier. And, you know, like the compound that I use might not work at all in the dust. So if you're going to be, if the groove is dustier, or if you're not in the groove all the time, then that tire is not going to work for you. So that's a good point and something to just think about.
And I guess that's down to driving experience and skill then, isn't it? Because you can keep it in the groove, whereas the mere mortals like myself can't. So we go off that line.
Yes, yeah. And, you know, for certain tracks too, like one tire is going to have so much more traction in the groove than outside of the groove, and that traction level is like really drastic. Say like at a race time event, if I'm using like a bar style tire, it's going to have a lot more grip in the groove than outside of the groove, to where it's going to feel like two totally different racetracks. And if you run like a normal pin style tire, say like a race Bangkok or something, the track is going to feel similar if you're inside the groove versus outside the groove. So then it's easier to kind of control your car consistently, just because the grip feels so much different. You know, if you run like a bar tire, like I might use, the grip level is just way different inside the groove versus outside. You know, and yeah, that's just experience and skill level, just to be able to, you know, put the car exactly where you want it to be.
Joseph, do we speak more about tires later this week, or how do you plan?
On Wednesday.
Wednesday. I would be interested to know Jared's setup-wise, how it was described earlier with Ronnefalk about this initial grip and so on.
We'll talk about that
So if you
later.
can talk,
Then.
yeah, like Wednesday also,
Yeah.
or even later.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Good.
Okay, so then one more thing before we do the terms. Can you see graph here?
Mhm.
So Dunning-Kruger effect. I think this is worth explaining here. So what the Dunning-Kruger graph really looks like isn't exactly like this, but the idea is that when you don't have enough knowledge of a subject, you tend to overestimate how well you understand it. And then when you have a lot of knowledge of a subject, you tend to underestimate how well you understand it. So what's relevant to understand here is, if we look at this, the y-axis is confidence and x-axis is competence. So this isn't about intelligence. This isn't about stupidity. This is just about knowledge of a particular subject. So if we are all here in this Invisible Speed course because we want to learn about car setup. And I think that it's important to remember this point, because most people in RC, I think, are somewhere here. Because setting up a car is, or let's say that understanding how to set a car up is very difficult. And the reason it's difficult is that it's a dynamic situation. Everything is changing all the time. The tracks are different, driving styles, driver inputs. To really understand what's happening is hard. So what has happened over time, and what people do is they try something on the track, they feel a certain way, and then they lock that in their mind. This is how this works. And then when there's many of those things, you have a lot of information, you feel like you know things, like this is how this works. If you take more time to learn more, you will notice that after you've learned everything, you feel like, oh, I'm pretty good at setting up the car. I know how this works. I'm so great. You're here. Then as you start learning more, you realize that actually most of the things that I know are wrong. I just proved myself wrong in this and this and this. And then at some point you're down here, you feel like, okay, now that I've learned more, I realize that I don't really know anything. And then you start learning even more, and your confidence grows again, because now you've understood more of how to set a car up, more of how the car works. The reason people get stuck here, I think, is because it's, once we make up our mind in something, it's hard to sort of change or open up our minds enough to to accept that we might be wrong. Okay? And I think that it's important to think about car setup in a way more like it's art than it's science with right and wrong answers. Okay? The physics behind the cars, it's set. I mean, the laws of physics are the same for RC cars, real cars. Those things are facts, right? But what exactly is going on in a car in a particular scenario or situation, and how you should adjust it, and how that adjustment is perceived by the driver, and that's more of an art form, I would say. So don't think of all of this like a right or wrong situation. Think of it more like an art form. And if you take that approach, then I think it's easier for you to keep an open mind and consider different ways of thinking and different ways of adjusting your car, and not getting locked into your own sort of rules that you have in your mind or that maybe someone else has told you. So I wrote here, it's not rocket science, but it is. And that's kind of how it is. So what I've been trying to do here over the last few years is take some really difficult ideas and concepts and simplify them. So when you simplify them, they are actually relatively simple. This week, we will go over some things that I'll explain, and they are relatively simple. I'm sure all of you will understand them. And then you will move on, and you can think about them and apply them to how you set up the car. But then as you learn more, you'll notice that actually that simplification wasn't everything, and there's so much more to learn beyond that. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that up to sort of remind you that car setup is art, not an exact science.
And it pushes physics too. I'm going to disagree about the physics, because I think sometimes it pushes the physics out of it as well.
Okay, then when maybe
But that's my opinion.
later on when we start talking about those things, then bring that up and let's see if we can find an explanation for it. Okay, so the last thing today, because when we start talking about these things, we need to speak the same language. So earlier today we started a list of terms, just simple things like, for example, pushing. What does it mean when someone says, "Oh, my car pushes"? Well, it means that it understeers. It means that the car doesn't have enough steering. Then another thing that came up was talking about the different sections of a corner, because if you just say, "My car pushes, I need more steering," that's not very helpful. If you tell me that, I will ask you, where do you want more steering? Do you want more steering into the corner, or mid corner, or exiting the corner, or on power or off power? So you need to be more specific. So it would be good to have an image of a corner explaining the different parts of a corner. Then
Are we gonna cover the sort of baseline of driving as later in the week?
That's
maybe?
tomorrow.
Because that's tomorrow, okay. Because that feeds into the pushing, because you can induce it understeer by taking the corner too late, I guess. You know, if you're not an experienced eye.
Yes, yeah. But for now, we just go over the terms. Average to top drivers, they often talk about rotation. Maybe David can give his definition of rotation.
Like what you mean, like corner entry. For me, like rotation is basically like mid corner when I'm kind of in between off power and going back on power, exiting the corner. So there, like I am very, how do you say, finicky? of how I want my car to be there.
Yeah.
So I like to have the car almost feeling a little bit loose, like in that middle of the corner. So if I don't feel the car being loose, so that instead my front end is kind of pushing and the car doesn't start to step out before I go on power, I feel my car is pushing and I'm missing rotation. So that's like when I'm talking about rotation for me, that's what I'm like talking about. Obviously then sometimes I can have too much rotation. And if I have too much rotation, I'm not talking about that like middle of the corner rotation. I'm then talking about with me being on power exiting the corner. So if I feel like I have too much rotation, the car keeps rotating on power out of the corner.
Yeah.
If I'm missing rotation, it's basically mid corner because that's where I set my car up for the exit. So if I'm pushing there, it would just keep pushing when I go on power, or I have to wait until the car is, it comes around the corner before I can even go on power. So that's like my two ways of describing rotation. Like rotation for me isn't necessarily going into the corner. So that's more for like mid to exit of the corner. That's where I feel we can talk about rotation. Like if it's pushy or understeering into the corner, that's a different word I would use for that. So that's like corner entry push or something like this.
Yeah. I would say that rotation is mid-corner steering, like you said, and it's almost sort of the automatic steering. So you as a driver do the same thing. You feel the same steering going into a corner, but then either the car turns really quickly around the tight corner or you have to wait for the car. So if you have to wait and slow down even more and then the car turns, you don't have a lot of rotation. If you turn in the corner and then the car just whoop quickly does the corner, then you have a lot of rotation. So I would say it has to do with how the rear end allows the car to turn tight in the direction of the front wheels. But if, let's say, if we don't go through these terms, then talking about something like this can be difficult because someone could think that rotation is just steering in general. Like I have a lot of rotation because my car turns a lot into the corner, when that's not really what we're talking about. You can have a car that has a lot of initial steering and response into a corner, but it lacks rotation. So it turns really well in, but then it doesn't want to rotate around the corner. So you have to wait for it to turn. So what I just said something there. Response, right? Responsive, so reactive. A lot of initial steering. So then this one actually I want to hear Jared's definition of this. So rotation. Because steering is one thing, I would say rotation is something else. And you hear that word mentioned a lot.
I would define rotation as how the car reacts like after you've already like set up into the corner. So it's more from like it's more like that middle part of the corner, but it's after you've done your braking and you're off the brakes and you're just doing the steering like in the middle of the corner after the entry. Just how quick it does the middle part of the corner.
So the definition I had here before was mid-corner steering, or quote, automatic steering. So the rear end allows the car to turn tight in the direction of the front wheels. And then I added now from what you said that rotation is what happens after corner entry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Then responsive, I have reactive, a lot of initial steering. steering into a corner, or unstable in sweepers. Loose, people often talk about how their car feels loose. Well, what does that actually mean? I would say it means that the car has oversteer, so the rear end lacks traction in comparison to the front. When you turn into, so steering into or mid-corner causes the rear to spin out. Another description of loose would be that when you get on power, rear end feels loose and the car wants to fishtail. Then we had some other words here to do with suspension. So load transfer. How load is distributed on the tires. This is constantly changing as you drive, transferring off some tires onto others. And then an important note that body pitch and roll does not cause load transfer. It actually delays it. Because very often people look at the car, and if it's moving a lot, they think that, okay, that a lot of load is transferring. Well, it's not the case. It doesn't work that way. Yes, you can see that, okay, if a car is rolling towards the outside, then load is transferring in that direction too. But you don't know how much load is transferring. If you have a car that's very stiff or maybe no suspension at all, load is still transferring, and probably more than in the case where you have a car rolling a lot. So that's important to remember. We'll cover this more on Wednesday. Then jacking. So jacking is the upward lifting force associated with roll centers, causing the car to stay up or lift up higher while cornering.
I've got two. They're not steering, but rear end support and forward drive.
Okay, that's very good. But rear end support is the only thing I've been hearing here over the last few months. Yes, so I would say rear end support is referred to when you are on power. So you're accelerating out of a corner and you don't want the car to roll onto the outside rear wheel too much. I'll show a picture here. So the more support you have, the more you can get on power and the car just stays flat and stable. And yeah, that's what you're looking for. For example, Robert switched to Mayako now, and he's always wanting more rear support. So what he means is when he gets on power, he feels that the car rolls onto the outside tire like this, and the front is up in the air. You can see here the inside tire is even off the ground. So when this happens, you are still turning and you're on power, and the car rolls heavily onto the outside. That means that your car is lacking rear end support. The roll bar, the spring, the geometry, it doesn't support the car enough. So Robert feels that he can't push hard enough because the car does this. So he can't get on power as much as he wants. He has to straighten out too much before he really gets deep into the power. So that's what that term. So the shocks, the anti-roll bar, the geometry of the car wants to keep the car flat and up. That's what gives the car support. And then dumping is a term used when there's not enough support. So the car dumps onto the rear outside tire. Front end support would be the same thing, but for the front. So off power or under braking, the front dives, rolling onto the outside front tire. And then support there is what stops that from happening. Dive is what the front end does. So the front end lowers when you slow down, it dives. Squat, the rear end lowers when accelerating, it squats. Roll, the car rolling side to side in corners. Pitch is the front to back movement, so dive and squat is called pitch. Then we had some definitions for grip, because it's something that we'll talk about a lot. So forward drive, it's the forward grip resulting in acceleration. So how well the car drives forward. Fishtailing, or fishing as Robert says, when accelerating, the rear end starts swaying side to side. So you're finishing the corner, you get on power, instead of accelerating straight, it starts swaying side to side. Fishtailing. Edgy. Edgy is a description of a track where the car catches edges and bumps, and you feel like you have to drive carefully to avoid flipping over or spinning out, losing traction suddenly. So that would be an edgy track. And then here, maybe we can come up with a better definition, because we couldn't think of a definition for medium grip earlier today. So high grip would be split into two, really. So extremely high grip means that the car can't slide at all. It's like Velcro. So if you're driving with pin tires on carpet or on Astro, that's extremely high grip. And then high grip, it can still allow for a bit of sliding, but there's really no wheel spin. You often run a bar type tire. You have to run harder compounds. That would be a definition for a high grip track. Then for low grip, when driving at speed, the car will always slide no matter what. The car will push, the car will slide with all four tires, or the car will be loose in the rear. When you accelerate, there's always wheel spin. That would be a low grip track. But what we struggled with was defining a medium grip track. It's basically, it's not low, it's not high, then it's medium. But that's not, I don't know if that's a good definition. One other we had was inconsistent grip. So when high grip and low grip is mixed on a track, usually it's due to dust. That would be a track with inconsistent grip. But do any of you have a better definition for medium grip?
It could be a good amount of grip until you push too hard. So you've gone past the medium grip level. But up to a certain point, you feel like, oh, I got a lot of grip. The track's taking my inputs. I feel confident. But once you go past the level of medium grip available, because you think there's more grip, high grip,
it slides.
You correct.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I think medium grip is just grip with just not that much movement, where your car's not loose, you're not having a whole bunch of rear end movement driving around, but then the car's not edgy and like wanting to flip over or something like that with high grip. It's just like a grip level where the car just doesn't have a whole lot of movement as far as like out of shape movement.
Yeah. That's better. So medium grip, not high or low grip. Car is responsive but not edgy. Limited wheel spin, not sliding. But when you push too far, the car slides. Yeah. That's pretty good, I think. Then we had diffing out. So when a diff starts working really fast, so one tire is off the track and begins spinning really fast, that's diffing out. So most or all of the power is delivered there. So let's just add a few more terms and then call it a day. Did you have?
I think pack is a term that I use a lot when explaining like shocks and grip and things like that.
So basically how shocks lock up on impact.
Yeah, more so how the fluid goes through the piston.
Would you describe that as like high-speed damping, I suppose, in full-scale terms?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, it'd be more, well, I mean, it
how your car
kind of
feels
goes, it kind of goes both ways. I mean, I struggle that with the mountain biking and like what that term is really considered. I would say pack is more a compression setting than, I don't know. It is high speed. It is high speed dampening too, but it's also in low speed dampening.
Yeah, it's like the compressive end of high speed damping, isn't it? So if you push down hard on your car, or you like, you throw it at the table, does the chassis slap into the table, or does the suspension stop it before it gets there, kind of thing? But then if you push down gently on it, you can clearly go through that.
Yeah, I wrote pack how shocks lock up on impact, landing jumps, hitting bumps, high-speed damping, the transition from shock moving to locking up. I mean, I think basically what we are talking about. I mean, when you are just driving in bumps, when you have a piston with smaller holes and more pack, the car feels more stiff and reactive to the bumps. When you have less pack, it feels more supple, soft, and plush over the bumps. And it's not like the shocks aren't really locking up, but they are in that transition point, I would say. So, yeah, it's not pack. I think when we talk about pack, it's not just landing and that hard impact. It's also that transition point that we can feel when we just drive over bumps. I think that's kind of what Jared was saying also.
Yeah, I don't really look at big jumps really at all as pack. For me, you have pack, you can judge your feeling like, yes, when you're in the rough stuff too, but then for me it's a big adjustment on traction. Like if I don't have enough pack in my shocks, my car doesn't generate enough traction. And then you go opposite, you go too much pack, then your car doesn't, like Joseph was saying, doesn't go through the bumps good, because when you hit like a square edge bump or something like that, your shock basically locks up when it tries to go really fast. It gets stiff. So yeah, there's a balance there. Some drivers can handle one way more than the other, and it's kind of a feel thing, but it's just a term that I'm sure we'll talk a lot about when it comes to shocks. But like Joseph was saying before, I think one big thing is like you have to have an open mind to set up stuff. Like he was saying, it's like an art form. It's not black and white. That's why I feel like, if you followed me much, I don't talk about setup a whole lot, just because it's really difficult, because it's not black and white. There's not one way to make anything work good. If there was, then everything would look the same. All the cars would be the same. We would all have the same setup, and it's like setup and getting the cars to work right. It's like it's always alive. It's always moving, changing, and so you can't just like, okay, now like I know what diff oil I need to run and like lock that in and like, okay, I checked that off my list. The cars are always changing, the tracks are changing, like the tires have changed so much, I would say, in the last 10 years, that like the speed of our cars now is so much faster than it was, say, 15 years ago, that like a lot of the setup has completely changed, because our cars go around the track so much faster now than they used to, and the tires have so much more grip, and they're softer, and there's so many things. So it's just, when going through all this stuff, you're not going to find like totally like golden answers that are going to just automatically fix everything, but it's just trying to gain some knowledge and just some understanding of some like direction to go. And then, the big key, like what Joseph was saying, is making sure your car's right. You can change your your rear camber link positions all day long. But if your A-arms are bound up, your cars are going to suck no matter what you do. And you're going to think you're learning about your rear camber link, but you're not, because your shocks are jacked up or your arms are bound up or whatever. So that's the really difficult part too, is when you're trying to take notes and you're trying to like change setup, the variables are always changing. So it's really difficult, that part. There's just some things I would think about a little bit, before all the classes all this week. We're going to go over a bunch of really good stuff. But like he said, setup is more of an art form than like a black and white rule book.
Yep. So to finish off, do you have any topic requests? So something that you would like to make sure that we cover this week or in the following weeks. So earlier meeting, someone asked about jumping. Jumping we will cover tomorrow. So it's part of the driving discussion. And then another point was brake bias, and some of the videos in the course are still missing. So for example, drive shaft bind, that we are going to cover that also. So do you have any topics?
Stock rebound.
Sorry, go on.
Stock rebound.
Yes, and also I was thinking that are there any terms to describe the rebound? So there are a lot of terms for describing like back and whatever, high speed, low speed, about damping. But what about rebound?
Well,
and
I
how,
mean,
how you
percentage,
think
isn't it?
about that in when you set up the car?
Okay, so I guess there are two different. So there's rebound damping and the rebound of the shock, that when we compress the shock, when it rebounds on its own. I guess those.
Yeah, nowadays because of these different kind of bladders and such. So this is what I mean.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's rebound damping or rebound.
I would say rebound is when you compress the shock and you let go and it comes out on its own. That's rebound. And then rebound damping is how much damping there is stop when you extend the shock.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we can talk about those things also.
Yeah, I wanted to
would like to
ask about.
okay,
Go on.
go ahead.
No, go on. I've spoken a lot already. Go on.
Okay. I'm interested in cornering strategies. Different drivers I see take corners differently, so there's not just one apex way to take it. Some like really snug the corner, some like to go wide and have more speed corner. Just some pros and cons, and just how to think about entering the corner.
Yeah, we'll talk about that tomorrow.
Okay, cool.
One point, so that was one of the points I was going to raise actually, which was cornering. But the other one is in the course material, there's a section on tools, which hasn't been filled in. So is it possible to talk around that? Tools that you would use or that you should have.
Yeah, actually, also, were you a part of this last year?
Back end of last year.
Okay,
yeah.
I'll link a video where we did that last year, and actually that file was never finished. Should finish that file and upload it to the course material. But yeah, I will put it on Discord, the link.
Okay, thanks. Also, is this that you're editing now, is that going to be available? Because there's a lot of useful information in there.
Yeah, so this meeting is recorded and will be posted, and then also these files that I'm compiling here, we will post them also. Okay, good. So
when doing setup changes, recommended increments, for example, when you change diff oils or shock oils, So how big changes do you make to not go too far to the other end, so to say?
Yeah, we talk about those when we talk about different setup changes.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Balance and how to adjust it with anti-roll.
Yeah, we will talk about balance. Okay, so tomorrow we continue. We talk about driving. I'm not sure who. Jared, will you be available in tomorrow's meeting at this time? I think David or Robert will be in the first meeting. Well, we'll make sure that someone else than just me is here to talk about driving. I think that would be good. And we'll also include jumping in that and racing lines. And then on Wednesday, we'll talk about setup. So there are a few basic concepts that we have to discuss. And then on Thursday, we'll go over the first setup parameters and homework for them. And then Friday, the second set, going over them and then homework for them. And then over the next weeks, we'll all, including Thibaut, Ronefalk, and Robert, they'll also have to do this. We'll do the homework, add our own notes to each setting, and then next time we have this week, which will be in May or June, we'll then analyze the results and then hand out new homework for the next weeks. So that's the plan right now. I think that will be the best way for you to learn how the different changes affect the car. By everyone doing the same changes, keeping your own notes. And then when we talk about them, we always refer back to these basic concepts that we talk about on Wednesday. So hopefully, if I do a good job, then you will all, by the end of this, be driving cars that you are happy with. And when you go to a different track where your car isn't working, you can figure out what to do to make it work. So,
thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll see you tomorrow, and hopefully we can use Zoom tomorrow, because I heard that there was 50 people in here at some point, and 50 is the limit. So maybe there were people who tried to get in but couldn't. So we'll try to figure out Zoom and do it on there, and then we can also have video, which will be nicer.
Yeah.
So anyway, thanks to everyone, and see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.